Imagine being punished for gossip by having your head caged in metal or being sewn into a sack with wild animals. Throughout history, justice wasn't just brutal. Sometimes it was downright bizarre. In this video, we're counting down the top 8 weirdest punishments in history. Stick around for number 1. It's a punishment that makes zero sense, but somehow they thought it was effective. Starting off at number 8. Ever heard of the ducking stool? One of the weirdest punishments in history, and you wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of it. During the Middle Ages and even into the 1700s, this bizarre device was used to punish people, especially women, accused of being scolds or gossips. Think of it as a medieval way to say, shut up or else. Here's how it worked. A chair was attached to a long wooden beam or lever. The accused was strapped into the chair, humiliated, and paraded through town. Then, in front of a crowd, they were dunked into a river or pond over and over again. The idea? To drown out the offensive words. But sometimes the punishment went too far. If the victim was held under too long, they didn't come back up. Some women were accused of witchcraft, others just for being too loud, outspoken, or complaining about their husbands. Yeah, life wasn't exactly fair back then. And men? Well, they weren't entirely off the hook either. If you were a troublemaker or a cheater, you might end up on the stool too. One of the most bizarre things, the public loved it. The whole thing was a form of entertainment. Imagine standing in a crowd, cheering while someone's dignity and safety got plunged into freezing water. Thankfully, by the 1800s, people realized just how ridiculous and cruel this was, and the ducking stool faded into history. Coming up next, at number 7, imagine being punished for public drunkenness by being humiliated to the extreme. Welcome to the bizarre world of the drunkard's cloak. In 17th century England, if you were caught drunk in public, you might find yourself shoved into a wooden barrel with holes cut for your arms and head. Then you'd be paraded through the streets looking like a human keg as people jeered and mocked you. It wasn't just England. Variations of this punishment existed in Germany and even Scotland. The idea? Pure shame. This cloak was heavy, hot, and humiliating, and the public ridicule? Enough to make some think twice before overindulging. But here's the twist. It was also dangerous. Some victims collapsed under the barrel's weight or were left dehydrated and bruised. What started as a punishment often turned into suffering. So next time you hear about bizarre punishments, remember the drunkard's cloak, a humiliating heavy dose of medieval justice. Next up at number 6. Ever heard of a punishment for talking too much? Meet the scold's bridle, one of history's most bizarre and humiliating devices. Back in the 16th and 17th centuries, if you were labeled a scold, basically a woman accused of gossiping, nagging, or criticizing, you risked being forced to wear this horrifying contraption. Picture an iron cage strapped over your head with a metal plate forced into your mouth, pressing down on your tongue. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was torturous. It made speaking impossible and left the wearer drooling, humiliated, and utterly silenced. But that's not all. Often, these poor souls were paraded through town for public ridicule, a literal walking warning sign to others. And the worst part? The offense could be as simple as voicing your opinion or challenging a man's authority. This wasn't about justice, it was about control, silencing women under the guise of keeping the peace. Up next, at number 5, ever heard of the term whipping boy? It's not just a phrase, it was a real punishment in history, and it's absolutely bizarre. In the royal courts of medieval Europe, young princes were considered too important to be punished, so whenever a prince misbehaved, someone else was punished in his place. That unfortunate soul was known as the whipping boy. The logic? Princes were often raised in isolation, with very few companions, and their closest friend was typically the whipping boy. The idea was that if the whipping boy was punished, the prince would feel so guilty that he'd stop misbehaving. Imagine watching your best friend get whipped because you didn't do your homework. But here's the twist. Whipping boys weren't just random peasants. They were often boys from noble families, chosen because they had to be considered worthy enough to be in the prince's presence. One famous whipping boy was William Murray, who was punished for the misdeeds of King Charles I of England. And get this, when they grew up, Charles rewarded William with a title for enduring all that punishment. Weird, right? A system where someone else suffers for your mistakes. Imagine that happening today. And that's how the term whipping boy came to symbolize taking the blame for someone else. Definitely one of history's strangest punishments. Halfway there, at number 4, imagine a punishment so cruel, even the name sends shivers down your spine: the wooden donkey. This wasn't a toy, it was pure torture. In medieval and early modern Europe, lawbreakers or soldiers who disobeyed orders faced this brutal device. The wooden donkey was a triangular beam shaped like an unforgiving ridge. Victims were forced to sit astride it, as if riding a real donkey. But instead of a saddle, they had this sharp edge digging into them, right between the legs. To make it worse, weights were sometimes tied to their feet, pulling them down, and increasingly the agony. Minutes felt like hours. Pain shot through their bodies. Some were left there for days. It was a punishment designed to humiliate and cripple without killing, and when the victims were finally released, many couldn't even walk. Up next at number 3, meet the Spanish tickler. No, it's not a joke. It's one of the most nightmarish torture devices ever created. This twisted tool was designed for maximum pain. It looks like a giant claw with sharp, curved hooks. But here's the horrifying part. It didn't just scratch, it ripped flesh apart. Used during the Middle Ages, victims would be tied up, helpless. Then executioners would drag the tickler across their body, tearing away skin, muscles, and even breaking bones. It was most often used on thieves and traitors, but sometimes the unlucky just needed to confess. The Spanish tickler wasn't just painful, it was psychological warfare. Even worse, victims were often left alive, doomed to a slow and agonizing death from infection. The Spanish tickler is a chilling reminder of history's dark obsession with cruelty. One tool, endless terror. And no, there was nothing ticklish about it. Coming up next at number 2, imagine standing in the middle of a crowded town square, your head and hands locked in a wooden frame, exposed, helpless. And then comes the worst part, flying rotten food. This was the pillory, one of history's strangest and most humiliating punishments. Used from medieval times until the 19th century, the pillory wasn't about physical pain, it was about public shame. Convicted of theft, slander, maybe just spreading gossip, the town would lock you up and let the people decide your fate. Crowds would pelt offenders with anything foul they could find. Moldy vegetables, rotten eggs, spoiled fish. The stench was unbearable, and the humiliation was even worse. Sometimes it went beyond food. Rocks, dung, even dead animals could be thrown. People laughed, children pointed, and you couldn't do anything to stop it. But here's the kicker. While the pillory seems ridiculous now, it was deadly serious. Some people didn't walk away from the experience. If the crowd was angry enough, things could turn violent, leading to serious injury or even death. Eventually, society realized this bizarre punishment was more dangerous than it seemed. By the mid-1800s, the pillory was abolished in most places, but it remains a chilling reminder of how public humiliation once passed for justice. And at last, number 1, imagine committing a terrible crime and being sentenced to the sack. No, not just any sack, a sack filled with live animals. This bizarre punishment was called poena culae, and it was reserved for one of the worst crimes in ancient Rome, parricide, killing your own father. Here's how it worked. The guilty person would be whipped, their head covered with a wolf's hide, and they'd wear wooden shoes to prevent escape. Then, they'd be sewn into a giant sack with a deadly mix of animals, a dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a snake. Once tied up, the sack was thrown into a river. The idea? To humiliate and punish the criminal in a way that matched the horror of their crime. Each animal symbolized something. The dog's loyalty betrayed, the snake's treachery, the rooster's vigilance ignored, and the monkey's madness. Drowning alongside these frenzied creatures was a nightmarish way to go, and the symbolism was clear.